Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be covering the custom checklists that I've created for myself when flying the general aviation airplanes in Flight Sim. Checklists can seem like a pretty boring topic, but they're actually pretty useful, and it's how you would do everything in the real world as well, and it translates pretty good to Flight Sim too. The checklist format I use is a little bit different from what you use in the real world and what you'd already find online, which is why I decided to share it. I've made two checklists available for download, one for the Cessna 172 and the other for the Cessna Grand Caravan, and there will be a link to download them in the show notes below. I'm working on building similar checklists for the Beechcraft Bonanza and the TBM 930. They aren't perfect yet, there's a little bit of tweaking I still need to do to them, but if there's enough interest, I'll make sure to make those available once they're ready as well. I'm going to walk you through how to use my checklist by doing a short flight, so let's fly. I'm sitting on the ground, and as you can see, the plane is powered off because I've chosen one of the parking spots as my starting point, so everything starts cold and dark. But I've got my checklist right here, so I can change that and get the engine running. I've worked really hard to get the checklist onto a single page per airplane just for simplicity's sake, and I split it into two columns that you basically just fold over at the center part if you're printing in landscape format. The first page is for everything you need to know from startup to cruise, and the second page is for everything from descent to shutdown. The top part of each side of the page has what I call the profile section, with the reference numbers that I use to know how to configure the airplane from one phase of flight to the other. The bottom part of the checklist is the actual steps that I need to follow before and during a phase of flight. On a real checklist, there would be a lot more phases like pre-engine start, post-start, pre-taxi, and so on, but I've condensed it down to make it a little bit simpler for use in Flight Sim by combining a lot of those sections. Right now you can see I'm walking through the startup process to get the airplane running, and that's really just a matter of going through each item in the startup checkbox and making sure that I take the action that's indicated for it and then move on to the next item. There are integrated checklists that you can use in Flight Sim for some of the GA planes to be able to familiarize yourself with where the different switches are. When you bring up the checklist, all you do is you click on the little eye on the right hand side and it's going to bring you right to that instrument or panel that you need to make a change to. Once you've learned a few airplanes though, you're going to notice that these switches are often in the exact same spots and you won't really need to search for the right button that much. Generally, they're either on the left-hand instrument panel, at below the main instrument panel, or above you. Alright, I've just got a few steps left to complete the startup checklist, and then I'll be ready to move on to the taxi phase, which is going to include a few more things like setting the flight plan and nav radios, a quick controls check, and finally heading out to the runway. I'll skip forward to that point in the video since there's really nothing else to explain with regards to the checklist while I'm still on the ground. Alright, now that I'm in position for takeoff, I'm ready to go through the takeoff checklist items exactly like the previous steps. You'll notice the last item in the takeoff checklist though says takeoff profile set. That's my reminder to check the profile at the top of the page to give me an idea of the type of performance I should be expecting from the airplane on takeoff. For example, in this case, I'm going to be doing a takeoff at full power with the flaps in the takeoff position, which means that I can expect to rotate at somewhere around 70 knots. I'll also need to slowly pitch up to 11 degrees after rotating to get a vertical speed just as I'm taking off of around 1500 feet per minute. I've also got in the notes section the VX and VY speeds to know the best angle and best rate of climb for the airplane so that once I am airborne and my takeoff is completed, I can continue to accelerate towards one of those airspeeds. Most of the time I'm going to use the VY number, but if there happen to be obstacles at the end of the runway, I'll use VX instead so that I can quickly get over them, and then I'll continue on towards the VY speed. With that information reviewed and fresh in my mind, I'm done with the takeoff checklist and I can start rolling. Once I get to rotation speed, I'm going to start doing a scan in the instruments to get either to the VX or VY speed that I'm aiming for, and I'm also going to start cleaning the airplane up, so I'm going to raise the flaps and the landing gear, if it has retractable landing gear that is, as soon as I'm clear of any obstacles. This is one area where my condensed checklist doesn't work great because raising flaps and landing gear is usually something you would do in a post-takeoff checklist rather than a climb checklist. It's okay once you understand that there are some items that sort of straddle two phases because of the way I've condensed it down. There are also a few less important items on the checklist, like turning the lights off, which is something I always forget about if I don't have a checklist with me. That's the perfect example of why I use checklists in the first place for flying in Flight Sim, because it makes the whole experience a little bit richer and a lot more realistic. The last item in the climb checklist is to again check the profile, and this time I'm looking for an airspeed of 130 knots with the power set at 2100 pound-feet of torque, and that's going to give me a climb rate of 1100 feet per minute. Now let's say the airspeed isn't matching the profile that I'm expecting. I'm going to actually start looking around to see if I forgot to do something like either raising the flaps or I haven't set the power properly. The profile makes it super easy to pick up on mistakes like that because you're going to notice that the numbers don't match up with what you're expecting. The other thing to keep in mind is that the numbers that are there are guides. Don't try and chase them to get them exactly because depending on the weather, the wind, the weight of the airplane, you're probably going to get a slightly different performance, and that's okay. Once I've reached my cruise altitude, that's where things start to slow down for the flight, and all I've got to do is validate my profile for cruise is set properly, and the only other thing I do is I prepare the descent and approach into the airport. For a VFR flight, that's usually going to be when I'm going to start descending, how I'm going to join the traffic pattern, what runway I'm going to be landing on, things like that. For an IFR flight, on the other hand, it's going to be more reviewing the approach charts and any frequencies that I need to configure in the nav radios to be able to land either with the localizer or ILS or whatever landing system I'm going to be using. Once I am ready to descend, it's time to flip the page over to the other side and go through the descent checklist and flight profile. I got 500 feet per minute for my descents for when I'm flying under VFR conditions because that keeps things nice and smooth. If you're flying under IFR, you're going to be using an approach chart most likely, and you'll have a steeper descent rate than that, but you can still use the 500 feet per minute number to use as a gauge to figure out if the performance you're seeing makes sense. There isn't much to do in descent other than monitor and make sure that everything is looking good, but as we're going to get closer and closer to the approach phase, things are going to start to get busy again. Another thing that you're going to notice in the flaps column of the approach profile is that I've got a number of 125 knots between parentheses, and that's the speed at which you can extend the flaps to that position. It's the same thing for the landing profile where you would usually go to full flaps and you need an even slower speed to extend them again, so I've got that airspeed listed too. If the airplane I was flying had retractable landing gear, I would put the number at which I can extend the landing gear in the notes section of the descent, because oftentimes you can lower the landing gear well before you can extend flaps, and it can be a really good way to bleed airspeed and altitude a little bit quicker. Finally, once you're back on the ground and you're ready for taxi and shutdown, it's really just a matter of reversing everything you did in the startup and taxi phase. But I provided those steps here as well just to make it a little bit easier to shut everything down properly. I think that should give you all of the information you need to use these checklists. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that was unclear or if there's something you think is missing, because I want these checklists to be useful not only for me, but for you as well. I'm going to wrap up now just by reminding you to hit that like button if you got some value out of this video and to subscribe to get more Microsoft Flight Sim content. I publish a new video every 2 weeks, and until then, I'll be off bicycling and enjoying the all too short Canadian summer.